things, and you pick up things from those people who are screwing up. And that's what cities enable happen. Now, I've put up this image of Mayor Bloomberg, who I think is a nice example of three things about New York's comeback. I think at this point in time I should either advertise or disclose if you want. When I wrote the book, I had no connection with Bloomberg whatsoever. I'm now a columnist for Bloomberg View. So the column appears every other Tuesday. But I keep this image up for two reasons, one of which is Bloomberg is part of a chain of innovation, like the chain that occurred in 15th century Florence, where people figured out how to think about the trade-off between risk and return. They often figured it out in the academy. That was then carried, embodied by people like Fisher Black and Jack Traynor to Wall Street, which then enabled people like the young Michael Milken to convince investors that high-yield debt, junk bonds, carried enough yield, carried enough return to offset the risk, which was then used by the young Henry Kravis to engage in leveraged buyouts, and Lou Ranieri put together his own his own securitization revolution, again using some of these tools. And Bloomberg is part of this chain. His terminals provide some part of the sophisticated technology that enables us to think about risk and return, to find new opportunities in finance. That's one reason why Bloomberg matters. A second reason, though, that Bloomberg matters is that he's an example of the continuing ability of cities to create cross-industry leaps. Jane Jacobs talked about this so eloquently in her work, The Economy of Cities, to have people draw an idea from one industry and then move to the next. Bloomberg, although he made his bones in finance, again, leave that for the fun of the translators, although he got his start in finance, Bloomberg is an IT entrepreneur. He's actually not a financial services entrepreneur. He sells these terminals, he sells knowledge, and in some sense he's competing more with the people in Silicon Valley than he is with anyone working on Wall Street. But he's able to succeed against those people working in Silicon Valley because he has information that the city has given him that those people never had, because he ran the trading floor at Salomon Brothers, because he ran their back office technology operation, and that enabled him, when he was pushed out of the firm and became an entrepreneur, to have the knowledge to start this amazing new company that he began and have this amazing second career. But the third point that I want to raise, which is I think so important in this image, this is an image of the bullpen, of the wall-less office that Bloomberg has put up in City Hall. That, in fact, is based on the wall-less office that he had at Bloomberg LP, which in turn is based on the wall-less offices in trading floors. Now, as you think about these offices and you think about trading floors, people crammed up on top of each other, there's something odd about it. Here we are with some of the wealthiest people on the planet, who any normal industry would sit behind large oaken offices protected by secretaries and oaken desks and oaken doors, enjoying all the perquisites of privacy and space. But not here. Here they're right on top of each other. Okay? Why? Because they have to know what's going on. Because knowledge is more important than space. And that is fundamentally what's going on in trading floors, and it's also why cities came back. Because knowledge is more important than space. Because people were willing to put up with the incongruous inconveniences of city life in order to be next to each other, in order to learn from each other. There's no industry where knowledge is more valuable than finance, where you can make a fortune overnight by knowing something a little bit more. And as a result, it should be no surprise that finance, above all industries, is associated with cities. Now, there is a statistical analog to all these stories, which is the remarkable ability of human capital to explain which cities have come back and which cities haven't. This is between 1970 and 1990 across the entire U.S., the relationship between share of the population with college degrees and subsequent population growth. So skills predict growth everywhere, but this is the much stronger growth in the declining regions. So if you look at this, among the least educated fifth of these metropolitan areas, growth was 8%. Among the most educated fifth, growth was 53%. Okay, almost a seven-fold difference associated with skills. Skills explain why Detroit, which only has 12% of its population with college degrees, is doing so badly, and why Boston and Buffalo and Seattle are doing so well. These were all former industrial cities, right? Seattle, in 1971, two jokesters put up a sign saying, "Will the last person to leave Seattle please turn off the lights?" because Boeing was shutting down some of its job lines. Think about how different Seattle is today because of Amazon, because of Microsoft, because of Starbucks. Right? All of these companies are new. They all were started by smart entrepreneurial people in the years afterwards, which reminds us that in many senses, the best economic development strategy for the city is to attract and train smart people and give away access to city streets and expect them to be used properly. You could never get access of food handled properly, as the Soviet Union tried to do doing this, and you can't do it with city streets. And the time to act on congestion is typically when countries are relatively early in this process before it becomes politically impossible, as it is in the United States. Though fees generated by congestion pricing can be used, as Ken Livingston has done so in London, to actually support than public transportation. But there's no place that does this better, of course, than Singapore, which is not surprising because in many respects Singapore is the best managed city in the planet. And here you have the second densest country on the world where right in the heart of downtown people are driving quickly because they're paying a fee that goes up during peak hours and that adequately reflects the value of those city streets. Of course, a third major curse is crime. And while we sort of, economists have good recipes for dealing with congestion, fighting crime continues to be an enormous scourge. And I know it is a scourge here in Latin America as well. Again, it's something that's particularly associated with urban density, and it is so often a reason why people flee urban areas for the relative safety of suburbs. I think it is a better solution if you manage to make cities safe rather than requiring people to create enclaves for themselves away from danger, but that's hard. And in fact, reducing the crime rates in New York, and you can see the explosion and the decline, some of this appears to be, relatively random, and some of it occurred just with large amounts of expenditure. But if you do manage to get this working, cities can be enormous places of enormous pleasure as well as productivity. The same forces of urban innovation and entrepreneurship that make cities productive also makes them fun. Now, the downside of cities that come back as places of both productivity and pleasure is that if you have, that creates rising housing demand for the area. And if housing demand is not satisfied with enough supply, and I was so grateful to hear the minister talking about the importance of housing supply, you can have an explosion of housing prices and an increasingly unaffordable city that's available only to the wealthy. What you're looking at is New York. The declining line shows the number of permits built in New York. The rising line shows shows real housing prices. You have a city that has turned itself around from the days where Jimmy Carter wandered through the South Bronx in that wasteland. But it's allowed less and less building over much of this period, and the city's prices went through the roof. It became increasingly a boutique town available only to the wealthy. And while I yield to no one in my admiration for much of what the great urbanist Jane Jacobs said, I think this one she got wrong. She went around and looked at buildings in New York City where she lived, and she noticed that old ones were cheap and new ones were expensive. As a result, this pushed her to think that the way you want to keep New York affordable is by making sure that no one gets to build any new buildings over old buildings. Okay? Well, that's not how supply and demand works. Okay? If you don't supply new housing in a high demand area, prices will go through the roof. And the way to satisfy that is by building large amounts of new housing, typically by allowing private developers a relatively unfettered hand to providing. Now, that's not going to push housing prices below construction costs, but at least it can keep those prices close to construction costs, which of course has not happened in New York. And you don't have to look any further than her own home neighborhood of Greenwich Village to see the problems that are inherent with excessive restriction, excessive historic preservation. She fought hard to have Greenwich Village be shut off to new development, a charming historical remnant. And maybe that is a great asset for the city. I mean, I certainly believe that our great pieces of architecture are treasures. But there's always a downside of restricting development. Because in fact, the type of townhouses that she could afford with her husband when they were ordinary income Americans in the 1940s and 50s have become multi-million-dollar affairs, $5 million minimum, available only to hedge fund managers. That is the cost of freezing an area to new development when demand is high. And you can see this in Paris and London and in successful cities throughout the world. Let's skip over this. Now, the costs of excessive restriction are painful in New York, but they're not catastrophic. But in developing cities like Mumbai, that has labored under a 1.33 floor area ratio maximum for much of the last 40 years, the costs are enormous. Okay? This is a city that has made it enormously difficult to provide private housing. And as a result, it has straitjacketed its bones. It has made itself a watchword for informal settlements rather than new legal development, and it has made itself ungodly expensive. This is the work of Tony Gomez Ibanez and Rios Nunez, looking at, you can't see this, I guess, in terms of the thing, but this is Mumbai up here. This is country population against purchasing power parity corrected Class A office space rents. Mumbai is the most expensive place on the planet by this measure, dwarfing Tokyo and Singapore because it has been so difficult. And as a result, Mumbai cannot play the role that Indian cities need to play in terms of building prosperity because they've made it impossible to build. Now, I want to end with a brief anecdote, and that brings sustainability back into this. And it's an anecdote about a young Harvard graduate. Oh, it's okay. It's okay. Young Harvard graduate who, in a beautiful spring day in 1844, went for a walk in the woods. He went for a walk in the woods outside of Concord, and he went to do a little fishing, and the fishing was good because there hadn't been much rain lately. But then he went to cook the fish into a soup, into a chowder. And as he was cooking the soup, the wind flicked the flames to the nearby dry grass. A fire started. The fire spread, and it spread, and it grew larger and larger. And by the time it was done, more than 300 acres of prime Massachusetts woodland had been burned to the dust. A whole ecosystem wiped out outside of Concord. Now, in his own day, this young man was castigated as an enemy of the environment. The Concord Freeman called him a flibbertigibbet. Again, good luck translating that. And they were it was understandably that they wanted to do so. He did more damage to the environment than any comparable person I can think of living in Boston or Cambridge during the same time period to the environment. Today, oddly, he is revered as the secular saint of American environmentalism. He is Henry David Thoreau, whose book, Walden, teaches a gospel of how great it is to live around nature, but his own life teaches a completely different story. His own life teaches the story that we are a destructive species, and that if you love nature, it is often wisest to stay away from it. As indeed, Thoreau would have done so much good for the trees that he admired if he had not spent so much time around them, burning them down, and had actually stayed at his books at Harvard instead. And indeed, there's plenty of modern work continuing to make this point. Together with Matthew Kahn, I've put together a measure of carbon emissions in different parts of the U.S. And this is just a snapshot of the kind of differences that you see. People who live in dense urban areas, just from the household sector, typically emit significantly less carbon, controlling for income and family size, because they typically live in smaller housing units and because they have shorter commutes. Even when they don't take public transportation, their car commutes are significantly lower. And the average urban apartment has, the average suburban home uses 83% more electricity than the average urban apartment, and that's just because of size of those areas. I'm going to skip over this, but often I'm just going to skip over this. The biggest reason to care about this, I think the lesson to take away from this is that cities are not some enemy of the environment. Those people who see that sort of living around green space is some environmentally wonderful thing while living in cities is not, they have it backwards. That actually the best thing we can do for the environment is allow cities like Bogota to grow, allow them to become more dense rather than spreading population out over longer areas. And the stakes for this are particularly high because of the rapid pace of urbanization in the developing world. That if India and China, and these are emissions, these are actually, those bigger dots mean larger emissions per capita, but in Chinese cities today, the median Chinese city's household emissions is 1/10 of those in the U.S., so just meaning from home heating and from transportation, because they heat, but they don't get cool, and they don't drive significant amounts yet. All that will change. And if India and China see their per capita carbon emission levels rise to the average in the U.S., global carbon emissions will go up by 125%. That may in fact be even higher because of the climate issues in India. It's awfully, a rich India will want to air condition itself very assiduously. On the other hand, if they stop at the level seen in Hong Kong, global carbon emissions rise by only 25%. Right? Density, buildings are not the enemy of the environment. They are in fact the friend of the environment. That living in rural poverty is not an option, and it should not be. Right? But in fact, we can think about something that is a more sustainable form of development, which is high rises in urban areas, or we can think about a less sustainable form of urban development, which is sprawl going over long areas. And again, I'm not trying to straitjacket anyone into one particular form of living. I actually, I live not that far away from where Thoreau burned down all those woods. But as an economist, I believe very strongly that the goal is to get people to pay for the social costs of their actions and to make sure that they're paying for the environmental as well as other social costs of those areas. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for having this wonderful conference.